What happens when a lifetime of devotion is repaid with betrayal? When the very family you sacrificed everything for decides you are nothing more than a burden to be discarded? For 72-year-old Joan, it meant being cast out by her nephew after her savings had run dry. But with the last few dollars to her name, she did the unthinkable. She bought a property she had never seen, a house in rural Mississippi completely swallowed by a monstrous, thorny fortress of neglect. She arrived alone, with no money and no one to help, facing a seemingly impossible task. The locals thought she was a fool, her family thought she was crazy, but after weeks of grueling labor, when she finally broke through the wall of thorns and stepped inside the house for the first time, the floor gave way, revealing a secret that had been hidden for over a century. A discovery so priceless, it would bring her to tears and force her into a final battle to reclaim her own legacy. Stay with us to the very end to find out how Joan's story concludes. And before we dive in, let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from today? If you believe in karma and resilience, hit the like button and subscribe. Now let's begin. The sound of the tape gun was the new punctuation of her life. Each rip was a sentence ending, a paragraph concluded. Joan stood in the doorway of her own living room, a stranger watching movers she didn't hire pack a life she was no longer allowed to live. Her nephew, Derek, directed the men with a practiced authority, a general commanding a retreat. He'd always been good at taking charge, especially when it wasn't his to take. "We're almost there, Aunt Joan," he said, his voice a smooth balm that irritated her skin. The guys are being so careful with everything that was going to a donation center, she thought. The sturdy oak dining table where 3 generations had celebrated birthdays. The wingback chair, its fabric worn thin in the exact shape of her evening reading posture. The grandfather clock that had chimed the hours of her existence, now silent and wrapped in a thick moving blanket, awaiting transport to a stranger's home. Jennifer, Derek's wife, floated through the room, a whirlwind of expensive perfume and hollow solicitude. She was the one who had orchestrated this gentle, brutal eviction. She held up a small object wrapped in tissue paper. "I made sure to save the important things," she chirped, her smile perfectly, painfully bright. Joan knew what it was without looking. The teacup. Her mother's, from a set of 12. The other 11 had been casualties of time, children, and gravity. Only this one remained, its rim a delicate map of fine cracks, a chip near the handle like a dimple. It had been worthless to anyone but her. Jennifer's gesture, meant to look like kindness, was just another way of saying that Joan's entire life could be distilled down to one broken piece of porcelain, that this was all she was worth. "That's thoughtful of you, dear," Joan managed to say. The words tasted like ash. Derek came over and draped an arm around her shoulder. It felt heavy, proprietary. "See? We've got it all under control. The apartment is all set up. You won't have to lift a finger." She knew what that meant. The apartment was a single bedroom in a sprawling complex for active seniors. It was beige and smelled of fresh paint and disinfectant. It had a view of a parking lot. It was a waiting room. The movers were carrying out her bookshelves, the vast collection of history and poetry and novels that had been her truest companions. They were heavy, and the men grunted under the strain. Derek watched them, a flicker of annoyance on his face. Honestly, who needs this many books anymore? Everything's online. Later, standing in the cramped, echoey space of the new apartment, the reality of it settled in. Her furniture was gone, replaced by smaller, flimsier things that felt like dollhouse furniture. The few boxes the movers had brought were stacked against a wall, a sad little monument to a life condensed. Derek, looking at his watch, pressed a glossy brochure into her hand. "Here," he said, his tone brisk, businesslike. "I checked it out. The senior center is just a few blocks away. They have activities. Bingo, I think. Water aerobics." He patted her hand, a gesture one might use on a child or a pet. "It'll be good for you to get out, meet people your own age." He didn't see the look in her eyes. He wouldn't have known what to do with it if he had. He saw a problem that had been efficiently managed. He and Jennifer had drained her accounts over the years, a business loan here, a down payment there, her nephew's dreams always seeming to require the liquidation of her own. And now, with the well dry, They were thanking her for her investment by putting her out to pasture. He saw a dot on a to-do list, and he was checking it off. He kissed her on the cheek, the scent of his cologne clinging to the air long after the door had clicked shut. "Well, call you tomorrow," he'd said. Joan stood there for a long time, the brochure still in her hand. The glossy photo of smiling silver-haired people playing cards felt like a mockery. She looked at the single, wrapped teacup on the new sterile kitchen counter. The one important thing, the silence in the apartment wasn't peaceful. It was a presence. It buzzed from the back of the unfamiliar refrigerator. It hummed in the ventilation ducts. It was the sound of a life that was over. The boxes remained sealed. They were an accusation. Unpacking them would be an act of acceptance, a surrender to this beige room and its view of parked cars. Joan couldn't bring herself to do it. For 2 days she moved through the silence, the unopened boxes like silent, reproachful ghosts. The refrigerator hummed its endless, monotonous tune. The only other sound was the clicking of the mouse in her hand. Her laptop was her one window, a portal out of the suffocating quiet. She scrolled past articles about politics she no longer cared about, past photos of her former friends' grandchildren, their happy, cluttered lives a world away from her own empty one. She drifted through the digital ether, a ghost in the machine, until she found herself in the shadowy corners of the internet, the places where things were sold sight unseen, no questions asked. Real estate auction sites, government surplus, properties seized for back taxes. It was a landscape of desperation, of last chances and bad decisions, and in the middle of it all, she saw it. A single, blurry photograph. It was less a picture of a house and more a suggestion of one, a dark shape nearly lost within an explosion of green. The location was listed as rural Mississippi. The description was a stark, brutal poem of 4 words, as is, land value. There were no other pictures, no details about the structure, no assessment of its condition. There was only that one defiant, indistinct shape, a house that looked like it was being devoured by the very land it sat upon. It was a ruin, it was a disaster. It was perfect. Something broke open in Joan's chest. It was a feeling she hadn't felt in years, a wild, defiant surge that had been buried under decades of sensible choices and selfless sacrifices. This was not a sensible choice. This was the opposite of sensible. It was an act of pure, unadulterated impulse. She stared at the blurry image, at the digital button beneath it. Buy now. It was a dare, a challenge, an escape hatch. She clicked it. The process was terrifyingly, anticlimactically simple. A few clicks, the entry of her bank information, a transfer of funds. The numbers on the screen shifted, her savings account, the last vestige of her financial independence, dwindling to a few pathetic dollars and cents. It was the last of it, the very last. The money she'd been told to save for emergencies, for a comfortable decline. She had just traded it for a ghost on a screen. A thrill, cold and sharp, ran through her. For the first time in years, she had done something entirely for herself. She had made a choice that wasn't about being a good aunt, a supportive sister, a responsible member of the family. It was a choice for Joan. She stood up from the laptop, the screen glowing in the dark apartment. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to have faded. In its place, a new sound, the frantic, triumphant beating of her own heart. She walked to the kitchen counter and picked up a pen. On the back of a receipt, she wrote a short, formal letter. "Dear Derek and Jennifer, thank you for your assistance with my transition. I have decided to pursue other living arrangements. My new address is not yet finalized. Please do not attempt to contact me. I will be in touch if and when I feel it is necessary. Sincerely, Joan." She didn't sign it with love or Aunt Joan. She signed her name, a name that suddenly felt like her own again. She folded the note and left it on the counter. Then she picked up the tissue-wrapped teacup. She carefully unwrapped it, the fine, cracked porcelain cool against her fingers. For a moment she held it, the last tangible link to a life of duty and quiet disappointment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she placed it in the center of the empty counter, next to the letter. A period at the end of a very long sentence. She turned and walked out of the apartment, closing the door softly behind her. She did not look back. Her car was an old, reliable sedan, packed with the few things she had managed to grab from the donation pile: a box of books, a suitcase of practical clothes, a framed photograph of her parents. It was a meager collection, the archaeological evidence of a buried life. As she pulled out of the parking lot and onto the main road, her phone rang. The screen lit up the dark interior of the car. Derek. His name glowed, a summons, an order to return. She could imagine his voice, the mix of concern and exasperation. "Aunt Joan, what is this? What have you done?" He would think she was confused, having a senior moment. He would never in a million years understand it as an act of rebellion. She looked at the glowing screen, the name of the man who had so carefully and lovingly dismantled her life. She let it ring, the sound tinny and intrusive in the quiet car. Then she reached over, pressed the power button until the screen went dark, and dropped the phone into the glove compartment. She closed the lid. It was a small, satisfying click. A door closing. A bridge burning. The miles dissolved under the wheels of her car. Days blurred into a montage of anonymous highways. The endless drone of asphalt a hypnotic hum. She drove until her eyes burned, pulling into cheap motels with flickering neon signs and the faint smell of bleach. She drank bitter, lukewarm coffee from gas station carafes and ate packaged sandwiches that all tasted of plastic and regret. She was a ghost on the American road, a silver-haired woman in a sensible car, moving toward an unknown future. She spoke to no one beyond the brief transactional exchanges with cashiers and motel clerks. The solitude was a heavy blanket. Sometimes it was comforting. Sometimes it was suffocating. One evening, in a roadside diner somewhere in Tennessee, she found herself watching a family in a booth across the aisle. A mother, a father, two bickering children. They were loud, messy, and vibrantly alive. The father teased his daughter, stealing a French fry from her plate. The girl shrieked in mock outrage. The mother watched them both, a look of exasperated love on her face. For a moment, the loneliness was a physical weight on Joan's chest, a sharp, painful ache. It was a glimpse into a life she had never had, a warmth she had only ever observed from a distance. She had poured her life into her family, and this was her reward. To sit alone in a diner watching strangers be a family. She forced herself to look away, to finish her meal, to pay her bill, and get back on the road. The car was her sanctuary, the forward motion her only purpose. As she drove further south, the landscape began to change. The orderly fields of the Midwest gave way to the tangled, unruly green of the South. The air grew thick and heavy, humid and fragrant with the smell of pine and damp earth. She was following the GPS on her phone, which she now only turned on for navigation, its voice a terse, disembodied guide. In 200 feet, turn right. She turned onto a smaller road. The pavement was cracked and uneven. In 100 feet, turn left. The left turn was onto a dirt road, red clay packed hard by years of sun and rain. The car bumped and rattled. The trees pressed in on either side, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. The GPS signal was getting weak. Continue for 1 mile, then your destination will be on the right. The road became less a road and more a suggestion of one. The dirt gave way to weeds, the path narrowing until the branches of overgrown bushes scraped against the sides of the car with a screech like fingernails on a chalkboard. Has she made a terrible mistake? The thought was a cold knot in her stomach. This wasn't just rural. This was forgotten. The GPS finally announced with a cheerful, idiotic finality, "You have arrived." Joan stopped the car and got out. She had arrived, but she had no idea where she was. In front of her, where a house should be, there was only a wall. It was a monstrous, monolithic thing, a solid mass of tangled, thorny brambles, 10 feet high and stretching as far as she could see in either direction. It wasn't a garden that had gotten out of control. It was a fortress. The thorns were thick as a man's thumb, gnarled and vicious, woven together into an impenetrable barricade. The leaves were dark, leathery and hostile. It was as if the land itself had decided it wanted its privacy and had grown a shield to ensure it. This was her house. This was what she had bought with the last of her money. A joke, a cruel cosmic punchline. She stood there, the sound of the idling car engine, the only noise in the oppressive silence of the woods. Then she saw it. To the side of the thorny mass, tilted at a drunken, defeated angle, was a single, rust-eaten mailbox. Its door hung open, a dark, silent mouth. It was the only sign that this place had ever known a human touch. She was 72 years old. She was alone. She had no money. And her home was a monster. A sound escaped her throat. It started as a choked sob, a gasp of despair. But then it changed. It twisted into something else, something sharp and ragged. She began to laugh. It was a dry, hollow sound at first, the laughter of a woman who had lost everything, including her sanity. But it grew stronger, louder, a full-throated roar of defiance at the sheer, overwhelming absurdity of it all. She laughed until the tears streamed down her face, until her sides ached. And then the laughter subsided, and she was left standing there, breathing heavily. She looked at the wall of thorns, at the rusted mailbox, at the impossible task before her. The tears were gone, her eyes were clear. She gave a single, determined nod. The nearest town was a 10-minute drive back down the dirt road. It was a small, sleepy place with a single traffic light and a handful of storefronts. Joan parked her car in front of a hardware store that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s. The bell over the door chimed as she entered. She used the last of the cash in her wallet, a pair of thick, stiff leather gloves, a machete with a wooden handle and a long, slightly rusted blade, a small metal file. She didn't have enough for a new blade, so the old one would have to do. The cashier was a young man with a kind, tired face. He looked at her purchases, then at her, his eyes full of a gentle, pitying curiosity. He saw an old woman, her city clothes smudged with dust, buying tools for a job she was clearly not equipped to handle. He didn't say a word, just bagged her items and handed her the change. The small-town quiet, which had seemed so peaceful from the highway, now felt both welcoming and deeply judgmental. She was an outsider, a curiosity, a problem waiting to happen. Joan drove back to her property. She parked the car, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment in the silence. The wall of thorns waited for her. It was a living thing, a breathing, growing barrier between her and her future. She got out of the car and put on the stiff leather gloves. She took the file and sat on the bumper of her car, the rough metal scratching at the back of her legs. With slow, deliberate strokes, she began to sharpen the machete. The scrape of metal on metal was a harsh, grating sound, but to Joan it was the sound of preparation, the sound of a battle about to begin. She worked until the rusty edge of the blade had a semblance of a shine, a dangerous glint in the filtered sunlight. She stood up and walked to the edge of the thorny mass. She took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of decay and green, growing things. She gripped the wooden handle of the machete, the feel of it solid and real in her hand. It was heavier than she expected. She raised it high, the blade catching the light. And with all the strength she possessed, she brought it down. The impact was jarring, a shock that ran up her arm and into her shoulder. The thorns fought back. A branch, whipped by the force of the blow, lashed out and scratched her arm, drawing a thin line of blood. But a single thick vine severed by the blade fell to the ground. It wasn't much. A tiny victory, a single cut in a wall that seemed to stretch for miles. But it was a start. It had begun. The days bled into one another, each defined by the rising and setting of a sun that seemed determined to boil her alive. It was a war of inches. Joan would begin at sunrise, the brief coolness of the morning a deceptive truce, and work until the twilight turned the thorns into menacing skeletal shadows. The machete became an extension of her arm, a clumsy, aching appendage that she swung with a rhythm born of pure, repetitive will. Thwack, scrape, thwack. A vine as thick as her wrist. Scrape. A tangle of smaller, razor-sharp briars. Thwack. The shock of the blade hitting a hidden rock. Her hands, even inside the thick leather gloves, were a raw geography of blisters, cuts, and deep, aching bruises. The thorns were merciless. They tore at her jeans, snagged in her hair, and pierced her skin with a casual, spiteful intimacy. She learned the smell of her own sweat, the coppery tang of her own blood, the dry, dusty scent of the cut vegetation baking in the oppressive Mississippi heat. The world shrank to this single, punishing task. The constant drone of insects was the soundtrack to her labor, a high, whining hum that vibrated in her teeth. At night, she would fall into her car, too exhausted to even dream, her body a single, throbbing ache. She would sleep for a few hours and then wake with the first grey light, her muscles screaming in protest, and do it all again. Progress was almost imperceptible. She wasn't clearing a path so much as inflicting a wound on the landscape, a wound that seemed to heal itself overnight. Yet after a week that felt like a year, she looked back and saw not just a pile of cuttings, but a narrow, 20-foot trench carved into the green monolith. And there at her feet, where she had just cleared a particularly dense thicket, was a single, smooth, grey stone. It was flat and perfectly oval, unlike the jagged rocks she had encountered elsewhere. It wasn't a rock, it was a paver, part of a long-forgotten walkway. It was the first sign, the first undeniable proof, that there had been a life here, that underneath the savage, clawing wilderness a home was waiting. She knelt, her knees cracking in protest, and laid her palm flat against the cool, smooth surface of the stone. It was a handshake across a century. The discovery of the walkway gave her new strength, but it didn't solve her more immediate problem. Her cash reserves had dwindled to nothing. The last of her packaged food was gone. She was living on gas station coffee and the fierce burning fuel of her own stubbornness. While clearing the area around the exposed paver, her machete had struck something metal. It was a small cast-iron lantern, its glass panels miraculously intact, sheltered from the elements by the thick canopy of thorns. It was rusted but beautiful, its lines simple and elegant. It was a piece of the past, and she hoped it might be worth something in the present. The only antique shop in the nearby town was a cluttered, dusty cavern called The Past is Present. Its owner was a man named Harlan, who looked as though he had been curated from the same era as most of his merchandise. He was stooped and thin, with a cloud of grey hair and eyes that seemed to view the world through a layer of dust. He took the lantern from her, his fingers running over it with a practiced, dismissive air. Kerosene. Probably from the 20s, he grunted, not meeting her eye. Not much call for these. Tourists like them, but we don't get many tourists. He peered at her over the top of his spectacles. You're the one who bought the old Miller place. It wasn't a question. In a town this small, her arrival was news. I am, Joan said, her voice steady. Worth anything? He asked, tapping the lantern. The place, I mean. I'm still discovering its worth, she replied, the double meaning hanging in the dusty air between them. He gave a short, cynical huff. I'll give you $20 for the lantern. It was a pittance, they both knew it. But Joan had no choice. She needed gas and food. She needed to keep going. Fine, she said. He counted out 2 worn $10 bills from a metal cash box, his movements slow, as if he were parting with his own skin. Joan took the money. As she turned to leave, his voice, dry as old paper, stopped her at the door. Listen, he said, almost as an afterthought, still not looking at her. He was polishing a tarnished silver locket with a soft cloth. If you find any old paper up there, letters, deeds, account books, anything like that, anything from before 1900, don't throw it out. He finally looked up, his gaze sharp and unexpectedly intense. It's probably worthless. Damp and mice will have gotten to it, but don't throw it out. Bring it to me. Harlan's strange parting words echoed in her mind as she drove from the antique shop to the town library. Paper, letters. It seemed an unlikely find, but the discovery of the walkway had ignited something in her, a need to know. Who had lived there? Who had laid that stone path? The library was a cool, quiet sanctuary, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat and her own chaotic, thorny world. It was presided over by a woman who seemed as ancient and immovable as the building itself. Her nameplate read Beatrice, and she was a formidable presence, with a ramrod-straight posture and a severe bun that seemed to pull the skin taut across her face. Beatrice viewed Joan with open suspicion. She was protective of her archives, the carefully preserved history of the town, and she did not suffer fools or curiosity-seekers gladly. "What can I do for you?" she asked, her voice crisp, implying the real question was, "Why are you bothering me?" "I'm trying to find information on a property," Joan began. "The old Miller place." Beatrice's eyes narrowed. "No one's lived on that property for 50 years. It's been left to God and the kudzu." "I'm aware," Joan said patiently. "I've recently purchased it. I'm looking for old property maps, surveys, anything that might tell me about the original layout." Beatrice was silent for a moment, studying Joan's face. She saw the dust in her hair, the fresh scratch on her cheek, the exhaustion in her eyes. But she also saw the intelligence, the seriousness of her inquiry. This wasn't a treasure hunter. This was something else. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades of budgetary concerns and public ignorance, Beatrice pushed her chair back and rose. "Come with me," she commanded. She led Joan into a back room, a climate-controlled vault filled with the scent of old paper and bookbinding glue. From a massive flat file cabinet she pulled a huge rolled-up map, its edges brittle and flaking. She unrolled it carefully on a large table. It was a county map from 1890, hand-drawn and beautifully detailed. Beatrice's long, bony finger landed on a small square of land on the edge of the county. "You're here," she said, her tone softening slightly with the reverence of a true historian. "On the old star route." "Star route?" Joan asked. "Mail delivery," Beatrice explained, her voice warming as she settled into her role as the keeper of knowledge. After the Civil War, the Postal Service started contracting out mail delivery to rural areas. They were called star routes because the contract was awarded to the lowest bidder who could carry the mail with celerity, certainty, and security. Strange things, those routes. They were the lifeblood of these isolated communities. The men who rode them were legends. They carried more than just letters. They carried news, medicine, money. They carried the whole world in their saddlebags. She tapped the map again, a strange, knowing look in her eye. A house on a star route. It wasn't just a house. It was a landmark, a fixed point in a changing world. The word star route became a mantra, a new source of fuel. It wasn't just a ruin. It was a landmark. It had a history. The knowledge propelled her through 2 more weeks of back-breaking, relentless work. She no longer felt the pain in her muscles, or at least she no longer paid it any mind. The Wall of Thorns was no longer a monster, but a puzzle to be solved, a curtain to be drawn back. And then, one afternoon, her machete blade sliced through the last thick tangle of vines and hit nothing but air. She stood, breathing heavily, and stared. She had done it. She had reached the house. It was smaller than she had imagined, a simple wooden structure, but it was still standing. The front porch, which should have been a pile of rotten wood, was miraculously preserved, sheltered for decades under the thick protective canopy of thorns. The wood was silvered with age, but it was solid. She climbed the 3 steps, her boots making a solid, reassuring sound on the planks. She reached out and ran her hand along the porch railing. The wood was smooth and sun-warmed, the grain worn silky by 100 years of rain and wind, and the touch of hands long gone. It was the first non-hostile thing she had touched on the entire property. It felt like a welcome, a handshake. After weeks of fighting, of tearing and cutting and bleeding, this simple, smooth piece of wood felt like a benediction. She stood there for a long time, just feeling the warmth of it under her hand. This was real. She had made it. She walked to the front door, a simple, solid-looking door with a tarnished brass knob. She turned the knob. It didn't move. She put her shoulder against the door and pushed. It was like pushing against a mountain. The wood had swollen in its frame, sealed shut by half a century of humidity. It wasn't going to budge. A year ago, she might have given up, sat on the porch steps and cried in frustration. But the last month had changed her. She looked at the front door, then at the large window beside it. The glass was grimy but intact. It was her house. She had bought it. She had bled for it. She was getting inside. With a deep sigh of resignation, she walked back down the steps, found a rock about the size of her fist and returned to the porch. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the house, and with a firm, decisive motion, she smashed the window. The sound of breaking glass was a violent, shocking intrusion into the silence. It echoed in the still air, a sound of violation. Joan carefully cleared the remaining shards from the window frame, then, with a grunt of effort, hoisted herself up and through the opening, her feet landing with a soft thud on the dusty floorboards inside. The interior of the house was a time capsule. A thick, uniform layer of dust covered everything, a soft grey blanket that muted all colour and shape. But beneath the dust, the house was undisturbed. It was as if the owner had simply walked out one day and never returned. Light streamed in through the grimy windows, catching the millions of dancing dust motes in its beams, creating shimmering, ethereal columns that reached from the floor to the ceiling. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of dry, aging wood, of dust, and of something else, a faint, papery scent that she couldn't quite identify, the scent of time itself. She stood in what must have been the main living area. In the center of the room was a simple stone fireplace, its mantel empty. To one side stood a rocking chair, forever frozen in a state of forward motion. In the corner, a small round table was set for one, a single plate and cup waiting for a meal that would never be served. It was the ghost of a life, a silent, dusty tableau of a solitude even more profound than her own. It was heartbreakingly, achingly beautiful. She felt like an intruder, a grave robber. But it was her grave now, her house. She took a tentative step toward the center of the room, her boot leaving a dark print in the thick layer of dust. And then the world fell away. With a splintering crack that sounded like a gunshot, the floorboard beneath her foot gave way. Her leg plunged into the darkness below, the rough edges of the broken wood scraping her skin. She cried out, a sharp gasp of shock and pain, her arms flailing as she caught herself on the solid floorboards on either side of the hole. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She hung there for a moment, her right leg dangling in the cool, musty darkness of the subfloor. Slowly, painfully, she pulled herself up, her muscles screaming in protest. She scrambled back from the hole, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She sat on the dusty floor, her body trembling, and waited for her heart to slow down. After a few minutes, she crawled cautiously to the edge of the jagged hole and peered down. She fumbled in her pocket for the small, cheap flashlight she'd bought at the hardware store. She flicked it on, its thin, wavering beam cutting through the darkness. She expected to see dirt. She expected spiders. The scurrying shapes of mice or rats. The bones of some long-dead animal. She did not expect to see what she saw. The beam of her flashlight fell upon the unmistakable shape of oiled leather. It wasn't dirt or vermin. It was a row of satchels, old weathered mail satchels, their buckles tarnished but intact. They were packed tightly together, a solid floor of leather and brass. Her breath caught in her throat. Carefully, using the blade of her machete as a lever, she began to pry up the surrounding floorboards. They were rotten and came up with a soft, crumbling resistance. The space was filled. Satchel after satchel, a dozen of them at least. All of them filled to bursting, their leather still supple, preserved in the dry, dark, undisturbed space beneath the floor. And in the very center of the collection, nestled amongst the mailbags like a king on its throne, was something else. It was a large, heavy book, bound in thick, dark leather, with a heavy metal clasp holding it shut. It was not a Bible. It was a ledger. She knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that this was it, the heart of the star route, the thing Harlan had told her not to throw away. She reached down into the hole, her trembling fingers touching the cool, smooth leather of the ledger. She felt the weight of it, not just its physical weight, but the weight of the stories it contained, the lives it had recorded, the history it had silently held for over a century. Joan sank back onto the dusty floor, the flashlight beam dancing crazily on the walls. The dust swirled around her in the fading light, a silent, ghostly witness, and she began to cry. The tears carved clean tracks through the grime on her face. They were not tears of sadness or pain, not of loneliness or despair. They were tears of overwhelming, terrifying, magnificent purpose. The house had not just given her a home, it had given her a reason. Harlan's shop smelled of dust and beeswax, a scent Joan had once found dismissive, but now found herself inhaling as a kind of antidote to the world outside. She had placed the heavy ledger on his main counter, the leather cover seeming to absorb the weak afternoon light. Harlan had circled it twice like a predator sizing up its prey, before finally reaching out a trembling hand. He didn't open it at first. He just touched the metal clasp, his professional cynicism, the armor he had worn for 40 years, dissolving into something else entirely. It was reverence. "My God," he whispered, the words a puff of dusty air. "I've heard stories, but I thought they were just stories." His fingers fumbled with the clasp. His usual practiced dexterity gone, replaced by the clumsy eagerness of a child. The clasp sprang open with a dull click, and he lifted the heavy cover. The pages were filled with a tight, elegant cursive, column after column of names, dates, and figures. It was a perfect, unbroken record of commerce and life, a river of information frozen in time. "This isn't just an account book," Harlan breathed. His face closer to the page, his eyes scanning the entries. This is the circulatory system of the entire region for a decade. Wells Fargo, before it was even called Wells Fargo. The cotton prices after the blight of '88. The cost of a train ticket to New Orleans. Look here, a payment for medical supplies rushed to the town of Flatonia during the fever outbreak. This isn't history, Joan. This is the source code. He looked up at her, his eyes wild with a fire she hadn't thought him capable of. The dusty, cynical old man was gone. In his place was a zealot, a true believer who had just been handed his holy text. "We have to call someone," he said, already reaching for the phone. "The Smithsonian, the Library of Congress." "Not yet," Joan said, her voice quiet but firm. She placed a hand on the ledger. "First, we have to know what we have." That was the beginning of the new war, a war fought not with a machete, but with magnifying glasses and archival tissue paper. Harlan closed his shop, taping a handwritten sign to the door that said, "Closed due to historical significance." His shop became their command center. He brought in lamps and soft cloths, and together they began the painstaking process of going through the satchels. Each one was a treasure chest, bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, deeds for land that no longer existed, business circulars and newspaper clippings. Each piece of paper was a ghost, a whisper from the past. The story inevitably leaked. The boy who delivered the newspaper saw the lights on in Harlan's shop at all hours. The postmistress noted the sudden increase in express mail envelopes sent to university history departments. The town began to buzz. A reporter from the county seat drove out, a young man with an ambitious glint in his eye. He interviewed a tight-lipped Harlan and a noncommittal Beatrice, but he saw the excitement. He could feel the energy. His article, a masterpiece of speculative journalism, ran on the front page the following Sunday. He dubbed the discovery the Post Office Hoard, a name that was both thrilling and dangerously reductive. It made it sound like buried treasure, like a pile of gold doubloons, not a delicate, priceless archive of human connection. Joan was reading that very article, sitting on her now-repaired front porch, when she heard the sound. It was the crunch of expensive tires on the gravel of her long driveway. She looked up and saw a sleek black rental car, so out of place in the rural setting it looked like a spaceship had landed. The driver's side door opened, and a pair of polished Italian leather shoes stepped out. Then the passenger door. Derek and Jennifer. They stood there for a moment, blinking in the bright sunlight, their city clothes, his tailored blazer, her silk blouse, looking like costumes. They saw her on the porch, and their faces broke into wide, practiced smiles. "Aunt Joan!" Derek called out, his voice booming with a false heartiness that made the hair on her arms stand up. "We came as soon as we heard. We couldn't believe it." They feigned delight. They feigned concern. They feigned pride. They walked around her small, clean-swept house, their eyes taking in the rustic simplicity with a barely disguised horror. Jennifer ran a finger along a dusty windowsill and then looked at her finger with disgust. Derek tapped a wall and noted the lack of insulation. Their praise was laced with poison. "It's so rustic," Jennifer said, her voice dripping with condescension. "So brave of you to live like this." They eventually got to the point. Derek sat beside her on the porch swing, its gentle rhythm a counterpoint to the tension in his body. "Aunt Joan," he began, his voice dropping to a confidential, conspiratorial tone. "We've been talking to some people who understand the value of a find like this. We have a private collector, a very serious man, who is prepared to make you a life-changing offer. We're talking millions, Joan, enough to live anywhere you want, do anything you want. No more. This." He waved a hand at the house, at the woods, at her life. Jennifer, who had been restlessly pacing the porch, picked up a stack of letters from a small table where Joan had been carefully transcribing them. They were letters from a soldier to his sweetheart, filled with longing and promises of return. Jennifer shuffled through them like a deck of cards. "Just think," she chirped. "You'd never have to worry about money again. We could set you up in a lovely place, a real home. All this money would finally help you live comfortably." The disrespect was so profound, so breathtaking, it left Joan speechless for a moment. They saw not a historical treasure, but a winning lottery ticket. They saw not a life of purpose, but a mess to be cleaned up. They didn't see her at all. "No," Joan said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the space between them with the force of a slammed door. "The collection belongs in a museum. It belongs to the public." Derek's smile tightened, the edges of it curling into something ugly. "Aunt Joan," he said, his voice losing its artificial warmth, "I think you're in over your head. This is a complex situation. There are legalities, taxes. You're an old woman alone out here. We're just trying to help." "I don't need that kind of help," she said, standing up. "Thank you for visiting. It was illuminating." 2 days later, a man in an ill-fitting suit drove up her driveway. He wasn't smiling. He handed her a thick envelope and told her she'd been served. The legal language was dense, but the message was clear. Derek and Jennifer had petitioned the court for an emergency conservatorship. They were claiming she was mentally incompetent. The petition was a work of fiction, a masterpiece of cruelty. It painted a picture of a confused, delusional old woman who had impulsively purchased a dilapidated shack, who was living in squalor, who was incapable of managing her own affairs. It twisted her life of generosity into a narrative of financial irresponsibility, citing the very loans and gifts she had given them as proof of her poor judgment. The post office hoard was presented not as a discovery, but as a crisis she was unfit to manage. The final pages contained the most venomous sting, a signed report from a doctor, a geriatric specialist she had never met. The report, based entirely on the concerned testimony of her nephew and his wife, questioned her mental state, citing her isolation, erratic behavior, and grandiose fantasies about her historical find. The legal notice was a cage. The last paragraph informed her that until the hearing, a judge had granted a temporary injunction. She was legally barred from touching, moving, cataloguing, or even breathing on her own discovery. The subfloor, which had been a portal to the past, was now a crime scene. She had been made a prisoner in her own home, the guardian of a treasure she was no longer allowed to protect. The whispers started almost immediately. The narrative that Derek and Jennifer had so carefully crafted in the courtroom documents began to seep into the soil of the town. She saw it in the averted eyes of the cashier at the grocery store, the woman who had just last week asked her enthusiastically about the find. She heard it in the sudden silence that fell when she walked down the aisle of the hardware store to buy mousetraps. The small-town community she had just begun to feel a part of, the community that had been her silent cheering section, now looked at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Was she just a confused old woman? Had they all been fooled? The warmth she had felt was evaporating, replaced by the familiar chill of isolation. Harlan was her only link to the outside world, a furious, indignant bull in the china shop of public opinion. He called her every evening, his voice a low growl of frustration. "They're poisoning the well, Joan," he fumed. "They've been talking to that reporter again, not just him, anyone who will listen. They're painting this picture of a beloved aunt they're just desperately trying to save from herself. They're talking about your health, your frailty. It's a public spectacle. They've turned your life into a goddamn soap opera." The betrayal was no longer a private, family affair. It was a headline. It was gossip whispered over coffee cups at the diner. It was her legacy, being rewritten by the very people she had created. Feeling utterly defeated, Joan drove to the one place she felt she could still go, the library. She expected pity from Beatrice. Instead, she got fury. Beatrice read the conservatorship petition, her face growing tighter with every page, her knuckles white where she gripped the papers. When she finished, she didn't say, "I'm so sorry." She said the absolute, unmitigated gall. Beatrice was not a woman who trafficked in pity. She trafficked in facts, in records, in the unassailable truth of the written word. This petition was an assault on her entire worldview. It was an abuse of the system, a twisting of the law to serve greed. It was, to Beatrice, a declaration of war. She pushed aside the stack of books she had been cataloguing and turned her computer monitor toward Joan. "They want to fight in the archives?" she said, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "Fine. This is my battlefield." The formidable head librarian transformed into a legal researcher possessed. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. Her knowledge of town records, obscure historical societies, and forgotten legal databases a powerful and unexpected weapon. She worked with a grim, focused intensity, navigating the labyrinth of public records with the ease of a native. For 2 days, she barely spoke, subsisting on vending machine coffee and righteous indignation. Then, late on the second night, she let out a triumphant "aha" that echoed in the silent library. She had found it. A dusty, forgotten town ordinance from 1888, passed in the wake of a contentious dispute over a lost shipment of railway parts. It was titled, "An Act for the Preservation of Postal and Trade Materials." It was a long shot, a flimsy shield against the armored tank of a conservatorship hearing, but it was something. It was a weapon. It was a start. Joan sat alone in the quiet house, the evening light casting long shadows across the floor. The hole in the floorboards was covered with a sheet of plywood, a crude, ugly scar on the heart of her home. The weight of it all, the legal battle, the public humiliation, her family's breathtaking cruelty, finally crashed down on her. The silence, once a comfort, was now an accusation. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, she wondered if Derek and Jennifer were right. Maybe she was in over her head. Maybe she was just a foolish old woman who had stumbled into something she couldn't handle. Her hand drifted to one of the few boxes she had managed to smuggle out of the house before the injunction, a small box of loose letters that had been scattered outside the main satchels. She picked one up. The paper was fragile, the ink faded. It wasn't a grand historical document. It was a simple note from a farmer to his wife. He wrote about the unseasonable rain, the low price of cotton, the health of their cow. And at the end he wrote, "I think of you in the field and it makes the work less of a burden. Be home by sundown, your loving husband, Thomas." The simple, human connection, the quiet declaration of love across a gulf of 130 years, grounded her. This was why she was fighting. Not for money, not for fame, but for Thomas and his wife, for the countless ordinary lives that were woven into the fabric of this collection. She wasn't just its owner, she was its steward, its protector. As if on cue, the phone rang, its shrill cry tearing through the quiet. It was her lawyer, a young public defender Beatrice had bullied into taking the case. His voice was tired, defeated. The news was bad. "The hearing is on Friday," he said, "and Joan, I don't know how to tell you this. The judge assigned to the case is Judge Carmichael." He paused. "Carmichael is a family values man, a staunch conservative. He's known for siding with the family, for keeping things out of the public eye. In his court, a concerned nephew trying to protect his elderly aunt. That's a narrative he understands." The last flicker of hope seemed to sputter and die. All hope seemed lost. The courtroom was small, panelled in dark wood, that seemed to absorb the light and sound, creating a dense, stuffy atmosphere. It smelled of old paper and furniture polish. Joan sat at a small table between her young public defender and an empty chair where Beatrice or Harlan would later sit. She was dressed in a simple, navy blue dress, the one she used to reserve for parent-teacher conferences. She felt strangely calm, a stillness in the eye of a hurricane her family had created. Across the narrow aisle, Derek and Jennifer sat behind their lawyer, a man with a silver mane of hair and a voice as smooth and suffocating as velvet. They were the very picture of solemn concern. Jennifer dabbed at her dry eyes with a tissue. Derek stared at the floor, shaking his head slowly, a performance of sorrow for an audience of one, the judge. Judge Carmichael was a heavy-set man with a face that looked like it had been carved from a block of granite. He observed the proceedings with an air of weary impatience. Derek's lawyer, Mr. Hayes, began his opening statement. His voice filled the room, resonant and persuasive. He painted a masterful portrait, not of a villain, but of a beloved aunt who had lost her way. He spoke of Joan's lifelong generosity, her selfless support of her nephew's education and career, but he twisted each act of kindness into a symptom of a deeper problem. "This is not a woman who ever learned to say no," Hayes declared, his voice dripping with sympathy. Her generosity, while noble, bordered on the pathological. She liquidated her assets, her security, her future, all for a family that I assure you never asked for such extreme sacrifice. He gestured toward Derek, who looked up on cue, his face a mask of pained gratitude. "This is a pattern of behavior, Your Honor, a pattern that has now culminated in this unfortunate situation. She impulsively purchases a condemned property, sight unseen. She isolates herself, living in squalor, refusing the help of her loving family." He paced before the judge's bench, his tone shifting from sorrow to grave concern. And now this discovery. A discovery that by all accounts is historically significant and financially complex. Is a woman with a documented history of financial imprudence, a woman who has chosen to live in a state of self-imposed exile, truly capable of managing such a responsibility? Or will this too be squandered, lost to mismanagement and delusion? He paused, letting the question hang in the thick air. He turned and looked directly at Joan, his eyes full of a calculated pity that made her skin crawl. "This is not an act of greed, Your Honor. It is not an attack. This petition for conservatorship is a last resort. It is a family tragedy. And in the face of that tragedy, it is an act of love." Hayes sat down. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The judge looked down at the documents before him, then over at Joan. His expression was unreadable, a blank slate upon which her fate would be written. The first witness called was Beatrice. She walked to the stand with the straight-backed posture of a woman who has spent her life shelving books and enforcing silence. She swore the oath in a clear, firm voice that carried to the back of the room without any need for amplification. Hayes began his questioning gently. "Mrs. Gable, you are the head librarian for the town of Hadley, is that correct?" "I am the director of the Hadley County Library and Archives," Beatrice corrected him, her tone suggesting he had just misidentified a species of fern. "And you have become acquainted with Miss Joan Albright in a professional capacity?" "I have," Beatrice said. "Joan is one of the most dedicated and methodical researchers I have had the pleasure of assisting in my 34 years of service." Hayes's smile was a little too quick. "A researcher? Or a patron who spends her days in the library?" Beatrice did not smile back. From a neat leather portfolio, she produced a stack of papers. "I have here, Your Honor, a record of Joan Albright's library activity since her arrival in Hadley." She slid the papers across the witness box to the bailiff. "You will find a list of every book she has checked out, histories of the Reconstruction South, manuals on archival preservation, legal texts concerning historical artifacts. You will also find time-stamped logs of her computer usage, showing extensive research into the National Archives, the Smithsonian Institution, and various university history departments. This is not the activity of a confused woman. This is the work of a nascent scholar." She wasn't finished. She produced another document. "This is a copy of a 5-page preliminary plan that Joan herself authored 2 weeks before your clients ever arrived in Mississippi. It outlines a proposal for the creation of a foundation to oversee the cataloging and eventual donation of the collection. It is detailed, it is well-reasoned, and it is, frankly, more comprehensive than several grant proposals I have seen from tenured professors." Hayes looked flustered, the smooth veneer cracking. "So she can read a few books. That doesn't mean she's competent to manage a multi-million-dollar find." "Competence is not the issue here," Beatrice said, her voice dropping, each word a carefully placed stone. "Motive is. Joan's motive has always been preservation. Your client's motive, it would seem, is profit." She then produced one final letter from her portfolio. "And as for my competence to make that assessment," she said, looking directly at Hayes, "this is a copy of a letter I received last year from the Smithsonian's American History Museum, commending my archival work. Joan Albright, the confused old woman you have described, helped me draft the grant application that led to that commendation." The lawyer had no more questions. Harlan took the stand next, looking deeply uncomfortable in a tie he had clearly been forced to wear. He dispensed with Beatrice's cool logic and spoke with the fire of a convert. He described the ledger, the letters, the satchels, not as assets, but as sacred relics. "You have to understand," he said, leaning into the microphone, speaking directly to the judge, "this isn't just old stuff. This is our story. It's the story of how a town, a county, a state rebuilt itself after a war. It's the story of ordinary people, their loves, their debts, their dreams. It's a national treasure. And this woman," he pointed a shaking finger at Joan, "this woman, with her own 2 hands, saved it from being mulch." Hayes rose for the cross-examination, his confidence returning. "Mr. Harlan, you are an antique appraiser. You deal in the monetary value of things. What would you estimate this national treasure is worth?" Harlan glared at him. "Its historical value is incalculable. Its monetary value is substantial. Which is why it's so important it doesn't fall into the wrong hands." "The wrong hands?" Hayes purred. "You mean the hands of a private collector, someone who might pay the owner, Ms. Albright, a handsome sum for her find?" "I mean the hands of a butcher," Harlan shot back. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, Mr. Hayes's clients have a very specific private collector in mind, a man named Marcus Thorn. I know of him. The whole industry knows of him. He doesn't collect, he dismembers. He buys collections, breaks them up and sells them off piece by piece to the highest bidder. A letter from a Civil War soldier here, a rare postal stamp there. He'd tear the soul out of this collection and sell it for parts." "Objection!" Hayes shouted. "Speculation!" "Is it?" Harlan said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "Because I have a friend who works for one of Mr. Thorne's associates, and when he heard what was happening he forwarded me an email. I believe it's what the young people call a smoking gun." The public defender took the paper and handed it to the judge. The courtroom was silent as Judge Carmichael read the email. His granite face, which had remained impassive through hours of testimony, began to change. A dark flush crept up his neck. His jaw tightened. He read the email twice, then slowly lifted his head and looked at Derek. His voice, when it came, was dangerously quiet, a low rumble that vibrated through the silent room. "Mr. Albright," the judge said, his eyes like chips of ice. "The email contains the phrase, 'liquidate the assets before the tax assessment can catch up.' Would you care to explain what that means?" Derek's face went pale. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping for air. The verdict was a swift and brutal demolition. Judge Carmichael dismissed the conservatorship petition with what he termed extreme prejudice. But he didn't stop there. He looked down from his bench, his gaze fixed on Derek and Jennifer, and the full force of his judicial wrath descended upon them. "In my 15 years on this bench," he began, his voice shaking with a controlled fury, "I have seen my share of familial disputes. I have seen greed and I have seen desperation. But rarely have I seen such a craven and despicable attempt to weaponize the law against a family member for naked financial gain. You came into this court under the guise of love and concern, and it is clear to me that your only motive was avarice. You have sought to portray this remarkable woman as incompetent, when the evidence shows she has been anything but. You have not only wasted this court's time, you have brought shame upon your family and sullied the very concept of filial piety. This petition is dismissed, and I would advise you both to take a long, hard look at your own lives and the values you purport to hold. You are excused." The word excused was an order. It was a banishment. Derek and Jennifer stumbled out of their chairs, their faces a mixture of shock and utter humiliation. They didn't look at Joan. They couldn't. They practically fled the courtroom, a gauntlet of reporters flashing cameras and shouted questions marking their retreat. They had tried to create a public spectacle, and they had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. They were now the stars of their own small-town scandal. Joan didn't feel triumphant. She felt a profound, quiet sense of relief, as if a great weight had been lifted from her chest. Justice wasn't a celebration. It was the restoration of order. It was the quiet, solid finality of a truth finally told. Harlan clapped her on the shoulder, a wide grin splitting his face. Beatrice simply stood beside her, a silent, solid wall of support. Together, they walked out of the courthouse and into the clean, sunlit air. Months later, Joan stood not in a courtroom, but in the newly renovated community room of the Hadley Library. The room was packed with reporters, townspeople and academics from the State University. She stood at a podium. The leather-bound ledger displayed on a stand beside her, its pages open under a protective sheet of plexiglass. She announced the official creation of the Star Root Foundation. Its first act was to formally partner with a national museum to begin the long process of conserving and digitizing the entire collection, ensuring it would be accessible to scholars and the public for generations to come. The foundation, funded by an initial grant from the museum, would be based in Hadley, creating local jobs and a permanent exhibition in the library. She then announced the foundation's board of directors. As president, she said, her voice steady, "I will oversee the general direction of our mission. Our head of research and archival standards will be Ms. Beatrice Gable." The room erupted in applause, and Beatrice, for the first time Joan had ever seen, blushed. "And our chief curator, tasked with telling the story of this incredible find, will be Mr. Harlan Reed." Harlan, standing in the back, simply nodded, his arms crossed, a look of fierce pride on his face. Her chosen family was now her official legacy. During the question and answer session, a young reporter raised his hand. "Ms. Albright, this is a wonderful day for you and for Hadley. But I have to ask, do you have anything to say to your nephew, Derek?" The room went quiet. All eyes were on her. She paused, a gentle, thoughtful smile gracing her lips. It was the smile of a lifelong teacher considering a question from a particularly challenging student. "I do," she said finally. "I hope he learns from this. Education has always been very important to me. The final scene is not one of victory, but of peace." Joan sits on her repaired front porch, sipping a cup of tea from a simple ceramic mug. It is late afternoon, and the sun casts a long, golden light over the land. The property is still wild, but it is a managed wildness now. The monstrous wall of thorns is gone, but a few of the more tenacious vines have been allowed to grow back, trained carefully along a new wooden trellis that frames the porch. A reminder. She is reading a letter. The handwriting is the looping, uncertain cursive of a child. It's from a 10-year-old girl in Ohio who read about her story online. The girl wrote that she used to think history was boring, just a bunch of dates, but now she thought it was like a treasure hunt. She wanted to be a treasure hunter when she grew up. Joan folds the letter and places it on the small table beside her. She looks out over her land, at the way the light filters through the pine trees, at the lazy buzz of a bumblebee investigating the trellis. She is at peace. She is home. The thorns had been the first thing she saw, a symbol of everything she had to overcome. But she understands now. They weren't just an obstacle, they were a shield. They were the fierce, unlovely guardians of a treasure, protecting it from the world, preserving it in the dark, quiet earth, waiting for the one person who was ready to find it. They were waiting for her.